Hi everyone, welcome to the November 13th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host Craig Milkowski. We're recording a day late this week. That Monday card at Aqueduct for Veterans Day threw us off a little bit and caused me to miss the podcast that Craig did last Friday when he gave out some opinions for the weekend, but we're recording this on Wednesday of this week, and we'll be back with the forecast on Friday, so back to schedule. This week on the podcast, there wasn't a ton of graded stakes racing to recap, but there were a few really nice cards at Aqueduct that we'll look at with some listed stakes races that were actually pretty interesting with some large fields and some noteworthy performances. We'll also talk about some racing from Churchill Downs and Del Mar, and we're going to highlight some impressive maiden winners, some allowance winners, some up-and-coming horses that might be able to do some damage over the winter, as well as looking forward to when they turn a year older in the new year. So, Greg, how are you doing? I'm ready to discuss some racing.
I am. I'm doing well, and it's kind of a weird time in racing with the Breeders' Cup over, but it's almost a little bit fun. It's like a reboot, and you're kind of starting over and looking for some new things. Of course, we'll still get some of the horses running back from the Breeders' Cup. We got a lot of big races coming up on Thanksgiving weekend, but I always kind of consider this the new time of the year.
I agree. I think it was appropriate this week that we saw some of those impressive maiden winners. Also, some horses returning from layoffs that I had sort of forgotten about that I'm excited to see later on. We'll talk about them in a little bit. And let's start with one of those races we talked about at Aqueduct at the top of the show. A lot of turf stakes racing at Aqueduct this weekend, some large fields, really great cards. And one of those took place on Saturday, the Artie Schiller Stakes, going a mile for the older horses on the turf course. And this race was really all about the TimeformUS pace projector leading in. I know this is one that you talked about on the forecast last Friday as a race that featured a ton of pace on paper, and it really played out that way because none of the speed scratched out. They all stayed in. They were need the lead types, and they really all went out to the front, tried to slow it down a bit, but it just didn't work out as all of the TimeformUS pace figures are color-coded red, and the race was just dominated by closers.
It was, and I have to give hats off to Joel Rosario. I think he was the difference in this race. Curlin's Honor is not a horse who in the past had shown to be a really deep closer like he showed here, but he sensed the pace was quick, took him way back, and was able to make that big run, got a clear run through on the inside, and the ground-saving trip was probably the difference over a couple of the other closers.
Yeah, Joel Rosario just put on a master class in riding this weekend at Aqueduct. He really found the key to the Aqueduct turf course because if you watched a lot of the racing, even beyond just the stakes races, they had taken the rails down on both turf courses, and it seemed like the inside path on the turf course especially was really where you wanted to be. And I mean, it's always Joel's style to save as much ground as possible on the turns and then tip out in the stretch. He just seems to ride those closers in that fashion so well. So his natural style just played really well over this turf course, and Curlin's Honor got that kind of ride. The seas sort of parted for him in the stretch, and that rail path was left open for him to come through. I thought Fergal Lynch also gave a really good ride to Caribou Club in second, sort of an underrated ride, because he also saved a lot of ground and sort of came through in between some tiring speed horses and threaded the needle at the top of the stretch. Just couldn't quite hold off Curlin's Honor, who was further back in the early going, and I think that really made the difference. Frontier Market, who was third, I think illustrates how difficult it was to rally down the center of the course. He probably was never winning the race anyway, but it just seemed like horses that moved out to the center of the turf course at Aqueduct weren't able to sustain their momentum the same way that horses coming up the rail were. And I think that's a theme that we'll see in some of the other turf stakes that we'll talk about at Aqueduct from last weekend. But Curlin's Honor, a horse that I just think is really finding himself now at the end of his 4-year-old season. And if he stays in training, maybe one that can do some damage in these grade 3 or listed turf stakes next year for Mark Casse.
Yeah, no doubt. And as you mentioned, I thought Frontier Market ran okay. It just, the track was against him a bit, and maybe I'd give him a chance. But really, if I was going to give some others a chance in here, it would be the horses who were up on or near the lead. These races are probably total line throughs for those. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of them come back in easier spots with less speed and run much better than what we saw in the Artie Schiller.
Yeah, the one that I do just want to give a quick mention to is Voodoo Song, because it seemed like Voodoo Song had found his best form again coming into this race. And I think it's just a little bit unfortunate that he found himself in such an unfavorable pace situation, because he did finish almost 5 lengths clear of the rest of the speed horses, those that were contesting the pace. They all finished in the last 4 spots across the finish line, but Voodoo Song was about 5 lengths clear of them. He had to rate in this race and still was trying at the top of the stretch. Just, he's never going to be successful in this kind of circumstance. But if he stays in training, he's always dangerous when he gets that clear lead, as often is the case in these turf stakes, because you rarely see as much speed as was signed on this Artie Schiller. Another dirt stakes that we saw on Saturday was the Pumpkin Pie for the fillies and mares going 7 furlongs on the Aqueduct main track. Not the strongest race overall, actually a lot weaker than when they first drew this race at Belmont. This is one of those stakes that was canceled when racing was discontinued on that Sunday closing card at Belmont a couple weeks ago. We lost a couple of the main players. I think Shalone was originally entered. She did not enter back. So a lot of allowance horses moving up to face stakes company in this one. And once again, Joao Rosario, it wasn't a turf race this time, but even on the dirt, he just gave another perfect ride to Saguaro Row. Unlike the Artie Schiller, the pace projector didn't really play out as predicted in this race because it didn't seem like there was a ton of pace on paper, but feels like a few riders got that in their heads and rode their horses very aggressively and sort of beat the favorite Philanthropic, who seemed like she was going to have a pretty easy pace scenario up front, but she took a lot more pressure than was expected.
Yeah, for sure. This one definitely didn't play out the way the pace projector had it on paper. Kendrick Carmouche decided to send Last True Love, and I saw some people talking about he didn't really give her her best shot, but I think it probably was. I don't have any problem with riders being aggressive in these spots. I did caution of all the distances where we use our favors horses on or near the early lead. I'm always most leery of the 7 furlong distance. It's the longest sprint. Horses have to go a long way, and even when you do get that easy lead, doesn't necessarily always translate to a win at this distance. I thought Philanthropic ran very well. She actually got the best figure in here, a 111 compared to a 106 for the winner. But once again, Joao Rosario just sensed the quick pace, worked out a great trip, and was able to get the job done.
Yeah, Philanthropic is one of those situations where the horse has an obvious pace advantage, but based on form, it's not like she had really run faster than the others coming into the race. And I feel like she ended up getting a little bit overrated just because people assumed she was going to get that. I mean, assumed with justification because paces don't usually develop in this fashion. But she really did have to improve. And it turns out she did improve. It just wasn't quite good enough to win the race. Saguaro Row, a horse that Joao Rosario has ridden well in the past. He just seems to have the key to her. She struggled to get the 7 furlongs in the past, but he just has this way of shutting horses down through the first part of a race, and he did that with her in this spot, and it allowed her to finish off strongly going the 7 furlongs. Don't think this was the strongest field or the best race overall, but just a good riding performance on the winner. Let's move on to another turf stakes at Aqueduct, this one for the 2-year-olds. There were actually a couple of 2-year-old stakes, one on Saturday and one on Sunday for the Colts and the fillies. The one for the males was the Atlantic Beach. Couple of horses, or actually 3 horses coming out of the Futurity that finished behind Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint winner 4-wheel drive. The one that took all the money was Freewheeler. He probably was the one that got the best trip in that Futurity, and not that he had a bad trip in this race, he just didn't take another step forward here, whereas some of the others did, the winner being Jack and Noah. One who sort of ran off in the early going of that Futurity, outran 4-wheel drive to the lead and just got a little leg weary late. This time, Jose Ortiz was able to ration his speed on the front end. He got to the rail, which is where you want it to be on the Aqueduct turf courses, and just put him in the winner's circle.
He did, and what I found interesting, it looked like there was a lot of speed in here, but he didn't have to run particularly fast to get that clear lead, and pretty much this race was over after the opening quarter mile. I mean, he wasn't like he was 3 lengths clear, but he was by himself about a length in front of everybody else, not going particularly fast, and as you say, on that rail, nobody was going to catch him, and he actually drew away pretty nicely in the stretch. It wasn't the fastest race, just a 101 TimeformUS speed figure for it, but really this hasn't been a super fast group of sprinters. I believe the Breeders' Cup wasn't a whole lot higher than that, the juvenile turf sprint. So solid effort, and just keep in mind with these 2-year-olds, they're going to keep developing. Their speed figures are works in progress. So I try not to tie myself too much to their numbers this early in their career.
Yeah, and the race really changed right from the start because a horse that I know I was interested in and one that figured to be on the lead was Montauk Daddy for Linda Rice, and he just got bumped around at the start and ended up getting squeezed all the way out to last place, and that just really put Jack Anoa in a situation where he could get an easier lead, and Montauk Daddy actually ran pretty well to be 6th in this race, closing from far behind, but he was never going to be competitive after losing the lead and not getting that and allowing the winner to get that kind of pace scenario up front. We did see a much faster pace in the filly version of this race on Sunday, the Stuart Manor, where Joe Rosario again just gave a perfect ride to Fly So Pretty. This was a race that appeared to have a lot of speed on paper, and it really played out that way as they all gunned for the lead. And he took Fly So Pretty to the back of the pack, saved all that ground around the turn. He swung her out to the far outside in the stretch, but after riding the rail for so long, she was still able to sustain that momentum and run down a very game Miss J. McKay, who I thought ran really well in defeat.
Yeah, as you said, it was a quick pace again. It almost feels like if you're able to pretty accurately predict these fast paces, you can just bet on Joe Rosario and head to the bank. He just seems to sense when it's fast. Like you said, it fits his style. And once again, he was able to, he dropped way back for a short sprint. He was pretty far back there, but was able to get up late. Not the fastest race at all. This race only got a 94 TimeformUS speed figure. Both the winner and the runner-up got those numbers. So this one, I am going to look at the number a little because it's just so much on the slow side for a stakes races. Even for 2-year-olds this late in the year, it's pretty slow. So I'm not going to get overexcited about this one. I'm not really impressed by any of these and probably look forward to betting against them next time.
Yeah, I agree that the winner got the perfect setup, and you're not always going to get that kind of ride and trip and favorable bias situation with the closer. So Fly So Pretty, if you had her at 10-1 this day, you did well because I don't think that's going to happen in the future. Miss J. McKay is a horse that I think you want to focus on out of this race and give another chance to, because Trevor McCarthy doesn't ride the New York circuit all the time, and he just had her on a 3-wide chase throughout, and that just wasn't the kind of trip that was really successful over the Aqueduct turf courses over the weekend. And she was actually not that far off that fast pace up front and made the first move into it. So she's a horse that I do think ran really well, and she showed in her prior starts she has real sprint ability. So I would upgrade her performance a little bit, but I kind of agree with what you were saying about the others, that they were just sort of closing into a favorable situation.
Yeah, I was mostly talking about the numbers from this race. Yeah. She had run a 101 last time, and if you think she can get back to that, she's certainly competitive. And based on the trip, there's no reason she can't.
Yeah, all of these stakes races we talked about earned speed figures that were okay, nothing spectacular, but we did see some pretty noteworthy speed figures achieved in some of the maiden and allowance races at Aqueduct last weekend. And the most impressive of all of them was probably on Sunday, a maiden race going a mile for the 3-year-old and up maidens. Communicator, first time for the Brad Cox Bard in just his second career start, achieved a pretty high maiden winning speed figure. I'll let you talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, he ran a 122 in here, which is it's huge for any maiden winner. Particularly as a 3-year-old and just his second start for Brad Cox, who seems to be on fire. He has quite a group of horses in our rundown this week, both here and at Churchill. But it was just a big number. I actually wrote to you, as you know. I sent a text asking you what you thought of the race because the number looked so fast. I have it as a really consistent day at Aqueduct. I would have had to be creative not to give it a big speed figure, which is not something I really like to do. The one question is it's not in between races. It was the first dirt race of the day. So there is always the possibility maybe the track changed, but I just didn't really have any evidence of that. So the big number stuck. And for the most part, when horses run this fast early, they tend to back it up going as they stretch out or as they move on in their career. I'm not sure how far this one's going to go, but this was just a really good effort. I went back and watched it a couple times, and the horse looked really good. And there were some horses in behind him who had run pretty fast already. So just a really good effort and an exciting horse. Kind of obviously he's had some issues as a 3-year-old just making his second start in November, but we'll see if he can hold together and he's past his issues. He's an exciting prospect in this 3-year-old crop.
Yeah, and his pedigree really highlights that because he is a half-brother to Breeders' Cup Classic winner and last year's champion older dirt male Accelerate. So he's got the pedigree to be a really nice horse. I know he showed none of that in his debut for a different barn, but he looked like a completely different horse for Brad Cox in this second career start. Just to give some insight into the track and maybe how such a high speed figure was achieved, and we'll talk about this as we get on to some of the other dirt races. The kickback seemed really difficult to deal with at Aqueduct this past weekend on the dirt courses. There were some changing weather patterns, some really cold days, and I know they could only work on the track so much, and it just seemed like horses that were trying to take that kickback and then close into races were just spinning their wheels. And I think that prevented some horses in other races from achieving some faster final times that they otherwise might have. We'll talk about the allowance race that happened later in this card at the same distance. But Communicator had to deal with none of that because he was out in the clear on the lead throughout, setting a moderate pace. And I think it was just a perfect storm for him to run a pretty high speed figure. I'm not saying that it's an artificial number by any means because he ran the number that he ran in relation to the other races of the day. It was just a favorable set of circumstances for him. All of that said, this is probably a really good horse, and I'm excited to see where he goes next.
Yeah, and that kind of is going to transition us into our next race with Network Effect, who came back. He was coming off a layoff since I believe it was last year. And he actually ran a decent race. Visually, he probably didn't look as good as Communicator, but he did get a 1:17 TimeformUS speed figure for the race. I'm curious what you thought about his effort and the trip that he had, and particularly how it relates to the track.
So I don't think he was really compromised by the track in the sense that he didn't have to deal with a lot of kickback, just a little bit on the backstretch. But Javier Castellano, who was riding him, really kept him out in the 5 to 4 path throughout. And he lost substantial ground in doing so, but he never really had him behind horses. So I don't think that way the track was playing really compromised his chances. The pace of this race was marginally slower than the maiden race earlier on the card, and this was a pretty slow, tiring, dead, demanding track at Aqueduct. And I think always in those situations, when you start out going slower, it's hard to sort of make up that time deficit that horses that start out going faster paces are able to achieve. So I understand why this race went a little slower in terms of final time than the maiden race earlier on the card. All of that said, Network Effect beat a decent horse in Air Touch. I know he was coming off a disappointing performance at Keeneland, but he had shown that he's a talented runner in that maiden breaking effort at Saratoga prior to that. So I thought Network Effect got back to his better races as a 2-year-old. And let's recall, he was a pretty good 2-year-old. He was beaten by Vekoma and in the Remsen, that good horse whose name is escaping me now, Maximus
Mischief. Yep.
Yeah. And he had run some really high speed figures as a 2-year-old. So it's not like he had to step forward that much. And I think it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here, because it seems like this is just a starting point for him. And he might be one that could propel himself into some graded stakes either over the winter or into his 4-year-old season.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that both him and the maiden winner Communicator earlier ran on the same card. And you know, it's kind of as a speed figure guy, people might think I would automatically bet Communicator next time out if they were to face each other. Who knows if they would or if they wouldn't. But if these two happen to show up, I'd probably actually lean towards Network Effect just because I did like his effort. I thought he could have run faster if he didn't lose so much ground. And it was just professional looking, and I doubt Chad Brown had him fully cranked up to win that race off the long layoff. And hats off to him for bringing the horse back off such a long layoff to look that good. We don't often see that, particularly with younger horses, but he's not one of the top trainers in the game for nothing.
And I'll just mention a horse that definitely was hindered by the kickback situation out of that race was Chad Brown's other horse, Aurelius Maximus. Not suggesting he was ever going to beat his stablemate, but he was just squeezed to the back of the pack in behind horses, taking a ton of dirt. I mean, you could see when these horses swing out the quarter pole, they're just totally caked in that sandy dirt surface. And I think it's hard for those horses to overcome that situation. So he's one, I think, to look for next time on a fairer racetrack. We'll see if he can ascend to the level that Network Effect has achieved at this point. Let's dial it back to Saturday and discuss two more races. One, an allowance race on the turf that was won in an upset by Devamani. This is a race that was really all about a couple of Chad Brown runners. And it's funny, they both did the right thing. The riders on these horses, Irad Ortiz and Javier Castellano, Irad riding Instilled Regard and Javier Castellano riding a first-time import Flavius. They both did the right thing in the fact that they saved ground for the entire way, but they just sort of left themselves with too much to do. It wasn't a very fast pace, and a horse that saved ground actually got some position towards the front of the pack, was able to get the jump on them and beat them all.
Yeah, and that horse was a pretty crazy 26-1 in Devamani. He didn't really have the past performances that looked like he should have been 26-1 in this field. But it just said he got a great trip. I don't currently have pace figures because there's still some setups on the new outer turf course where I just don't have enough data to make them. But given this is a race, we'll probably see some of these horses step up in the better competition. I will work backwards as I get more data and try to add pace figures in for this one. down. So when the horses show up, maybe not next time, but at least at the worst by the time after that, you will see some pace numbers. But as you said, just watching the race visually, it didn't look like there was a whole lot of pace on. And, I thought all of the top four ran pretty well, but I wouldn't dismiss the two Chad Brown horses and Still Regard and Flavius off of this effort.
Yeah, it's funny how handicappers perceive situations some of the time, because you're totally right. Devimani had run speed figures that made him basically just as fast as Instilled Regard. And I mean, Flavius is a horse that hadn't run in the US yet, but I mean, it's not like his time form ratings over in Europe, based on what he had done up until this point, made him some standout in this race. But people perceive those Chad Brown runners as having all the upside, and it just turned out, well, they didn't take those steps forward, so they were obviously serious underlays. People were very upset, I saw on Twitter, about the trip that Flavius got. I mean, I guess that he was kind of jammed up inside and encountered some traffic early, and he was too far back. I understand all of that. I didn't think he did a ton of running, even when he got into the clear in the lane. Maybe rallying up the rail wasn't what he wanted to do, but he's a horse that was very highly touted in Europe. He's obviously had some long layoffs. I just wonder if he's as good as what they were hoping that he would be in this country. Instilled Regard probably should have won this race if he'd gotten free earlier, because he really was closing with a rush at the end into some moderate fractions. But like we said, Devimani just got the jump on them and really shouldn't have been that big of a price. I understand all of that. One more race to talk about from Aqueduct last weekend is another race on the Saturday card, actually a little bit earlier, just one race earlier. That was a debut by Seducer, and I think a noteworthy debut because you don't often see two-year-olds on the turf achieving the kind of numbers that this filly got. She did have a lot in her favor because she was riding the rail the entire way, which we talked about. That's where you wanted to be. And it's not like the pace of this race was anything close to fast. It was pretty moderate. But she did it well, and she spurted away under minimal encouragement from who else? Joe Rosario, and just looked really good in the stretch. And he geared her down late. Not sure what she was beating, but she looks like one with stakes potential.
Yes, she does, and the number backs it up. She ran a 107 first out, so for a 2-year-old first time out, going long. Impressive effort for me. Christophe Clement, he seems to send them out ready. Not surprised. I'm a little surprised how this one went off 15-1. I don't remember what the exact betting, who was taking the money in here. I think it was the runner-up, actually, off a decent third. But good effort, and I do look forward to seeing what this one's going to do. It's interesting. Clement is really good at turf sprints, but he started this one out in a route. So I suspect he thinks that distance won't be a problem for her. And, I assume she'll show up in stakes pretty soon.
Yeah, apparently Christophe Clement has saved some of his best bullets to fire for late in the season, because this was actually one of 3 debut winners that he sent out this past weekend at Aqueduct, all on the turf. So he's got some good horses still in his barn, apparently, and those all went off after this filly at much shorter prices, but I think they missed the boat on the best one of them all, which was Seducer, and I'm interested to see where she shows up next. Let's move on to some other venues. We'll talk about, I think, the only graded stakes of the past weekend at Churchill, which was the Grade 3 Commonwealth. Interesting turf stakes for the 3-year-olds. It looked very competitive coming in, a really evenly matched crew. A lot of them had faced each other before, but had kind of taken turns beating each other. But it was kind of a new face that got the job done in Mr. Dumas. He was coming out of just one prior turf route effort last time out of Churchill. Downs beaten allowance group and just took a step forward and seems like one of the more lightly raced members of this 3-year-old crop. It's just really improving at the end of the year.
Yeah, and it's a good time to do it. We're running out of spots for these 3-year-olds to take on their own age group, and he's really looked like a new horse since he switched to turf. He sprinted that first time at Kentucky Downs, and he ran a decent third with a 1:14. Then he stretched out to 1 mile and an eighth and won while right up on the lead. And what was impressive here is he was able to take back well off the pace. He was much further back than he had been in his prior route where he was right up front. And he handled it perfectly, which is something you don't often see. And versatility, particularly in turf races, is an asset you want to have. So he got a 1:17 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, the top one that he's had yet in his career. And I just thought this was a really solid effort. And I'll be curious where he shows up, because he's as good as most of the 3-year-olds we've seen already this year on the turf.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see what happens with this class of 3-year-old turf horses as we move into next season, because unlike with the horses that race on dirt, you don't often see the 3-year-old turf horses step up against older runners during their 3-year-old seasons. You have to kind of wait until they turn 4-year-olds for them to try those open company age races. And we talked about it with all that grade one racing in New York through the summer and into the fall. None of them are really breaking out of that 115, 116, 117 TimeformUS speed figure ceiling. And Mr. Dumas achieved basically that same number, 117, even though this was just a grade 3 race. So I think all of these horses are going to have to take a step forward if they still compete as 4-year-olds. But I don't think that we've seen a whole lot of horses that have run a whole lot better than this in this 3-year-old turf division. So he's definitely one to keep your eye on. Some other racing from Churchill Downs last week and a couple of allowance races that achieved some noteworthy speed figures. Where She Told Me to Go won an allowance race on Thursday. This was a sloppy track that he ran over going the 7 furlongs. These are actually 2 Brad Cox trainees we're about to talk about. This one I think has only been with Brad Cox for 3 starts now. Definitely taken a step forward now as a 4-year-old. I think this was just his 3rd start since when he had that incident in Parks where he tried to take a bite out of Firenze Fire. But definitely one that seems like he's doing pretty well now heading into his 5-year-old season.
Yeah, he does. And I mean, that's when horses get their best if they stick around long enough for us to see him. And that was the reason I kind of pointed this out, this race. He took a very nice jump. He beat a solid field of allowance horses pretty easily. I mean, he was right up there on a fairly fast pace and just blew away from him in the stretch. It's funny you mentioned that. I had forgot he was a horse who tried to bite Firenze Fire. But yeah, it was in the Gallon Bob last year. But I visually was impressed with this effort. He got a 116 TimeformUS speed figure, so he'll have to step it up a little bit if he wants to enter stakes competition. But I think it's there. He can probably do it. He's run faster in the past, and I think there was a little bit more in the tank on Thursday.
And we saw another up-and-comer for Brad Cox competing on Sunday at Churchill Downs in another allowance race, this one going the 2 turns, as Night Ops, a 3-year-old who's about to turn 4 years old, earned that same 116 TimeformUS speed figure. This one was facing a couple of common rivals from a very strong allowance race that was run a month earlier at Keeneland. And he turned the tables on a horse that had finished ahead of him last time, Pirate's Punch. Those two battled down to the wire. And I thought Night Ops was pretty game to hold that runner at bay in the late stages because it looked like he might be hanging a little bit, and he was able to gut out the victory.
Yeah, it was a solid effort. Night Ops has kind of been knocking at the door. He's run against some good horses this year without ever really breaking through. So, I mean, I think this was his best win. He had won at Churchill back in June, so possible maybe he just really likes Churchill more than some other tracks. But I thought it was a good effort. His speed figures are moving in the right direction. That 116 was a career best after a 113 last time. As just said, when he finished behind Pirate's Punch and Gray Magician, the winner, who's been a very solid 3-year-old this year, won a lot of money. So he's another one you can add. I imagine he'll be in some stakes races coming up, and he just looked good. And I'm really impressed with Brad Cox. As I said, we've mentioned him several times on this show, and he's probably one of the top trainers in the game these days. He just seems to do the best. It doesn't matter on surface. He handles dirt, turf. He can train them all, and he's really an up-and-coming name in this game.
Yeah, I think all of the Brad Cox trainees that we just mentioned are up-and-coming types that look like they have stakes potential but haven't really achieved it yet. So it'll be interesting to see what they do over the winter and into next year. Let's head out to California to the final venue we'll visit, Del Mar, where they ran 3 lower-level stakes races last weekend. We'll begin with one on the turf from Saturday. That was the Let It Ride for the 3-year-olds going a mile. And this race was really dominated by horses coming off layoffs, as the one coming off the longest layoff of all, Bob and Jackie, got the victory in a very narrow decision. He was stalking the pace, got the jump on Proud Pedro, who was trying to make a late rush from last place in a 5-horse field. And it was good to see this horse, Bob and Jackie, get back to his best performances as a 2-year-old and actually improve on them a little bit because he showed real promise last year. And he just picked up right where he left off in this Let It Ride.
Yeah, this was actually one of the few things I got right on the forecast Friday. I kind of cautioned people, don't base your bets on this horse's 100 and 102 speed figures as a 2-year-old, because coming back a year later, these horses aren't going to run the same numbers if they're in the same kind of form. And so you just had to have some faith in Richard Baltas, and it's one of the top turf trainers in the game. You figure he's going to have him ready, and he did. And he got a nice 115. Not quite as good as Mr. Dumas ran at Churchill, but fits right in with all the other 3-year-olds we've seen. And this one obviously has some upside. He's been off over almost a year before this one. So if there's anybody who can improve a horse, it'll be Baltus, and we'll see where this one goes. I would imagine a graded stakes try will be coming up pretty soon for this one.
Now, maybe I'm biased because I bet the runner-up, but I thought Proud Pedro might have been best in this race because it was a pretty moderate pace up front, and he made that late rush from the back of the pack, and it almost looked like he had gotten the bob at first glance because that camera angle at Del Mar is not really straight on. It's not quite perpendicular to where the camera is situated, but he didn't quite get up there. Coming off a layoff, though, I thought he ran well, too, and both of these horses achieved some respectable speed figures for a race at this level, especially considering that they're just 3-year-olds. Let's take a look at a race at the same distance from, I believe it was Friday's card, the Catherine Crosby for older fillies on the turf. And this one featured a completely different pace situation as they went really fast up front. 2 horses just basically ran off on the lead in a duel. And, I mean, this is as big of a pace collapse as I think you'll ever see. And that's why a huge long shot was able to win.
Yeah, wicked old fashioned, and props to my assistant out in California, the unknown Figuremaker, as we'll call him. He had this horse coming in fast. She had the co-best TimeformUS speed figure in the field, which you don't often see on a 32-1 shot. And she definitely got the right trip. It was a great ride by Ramon, who this horse isn't one who's shown to often comes from that far back, but almost like Joel back east, he adapted to that really fast pace and gave a perfectly timed ride to just get up in the last bob.
Yeah, it's funny. When I looked up her PPs, I was expecting her to be some horse that didn't look like a deserving winner of this race. And while she had run some high TimeformUS speed figures in the past, I know she wasn't quite as highly rated on some other speed figures. But, I mean, just looking at her career record, she's now 11 for 22 in her career. She's run one half of her starts. She's been just a terror up in Northern California. So this is a filly that, albeit against weaker company, had really done some damage in her prior starts. So maybe she actually is this good. I will say this is one of these races where the horses that achieved the highest TimeformUS speed figures actually finished 5th and 4th, respectively. So definitely one where you want to upgrade horses that were up close to the pace situation. And I think Lost in Translation actually ran really well. She was a big long shot in this race, but she held on for 5th and briefly looked like she might hold on to it for at least a piece of the purse at about the 8th pole. But she just kind of fell apart as all the other speeds did at the end of this race.
Yeah, it's interesting looking through the winners' PPs. Not to brush over what you said, you're of course right. The speed had the worst of it in here by far, but this was a horse who's actually been claimed a few times back in her career for as little as $14,000. So always cool to see these claiming fillies or mares step up and win a stakes race like this. I'm not sure that she has graded stakes in her futures, but it's quite an accomplishment to have a horse rise up to this level from lower level claiming races.
One more race to look at from Del Mar, one more race to look at on this TimeformUS Pacecast this week is the Desing Arnez from Sunday, going back to the 2-year-olds. This race was at 6.5 furlongs on the dirt. And Laocothea, a horse that we've talked about, I think, a couple times before on the podcast, she won this race despite the fact that she didn't make the early lead. And I think the big concern with her going into this race was that she was sort of one of these runners that if she encountered a straw on her path, she would just kind of fall apart. And to her credit, she showed that she could actually rate off another horse in this race, at least through the first quarter mile. She took over. I know she was just 2-5, so she was expected to win, but she did this really easily and looked pretty good in victory.
She did. She only got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. I'm not sure how much stock you want to put in that. As you said, she did kind of have the field over the barrel. As far as her being a need to lead type, I'd still be a little cautious with her. You often see horses that'll rate like this when they're heavy favorites against overmatched foes, and when they step back up against tougher competition, they'll revert right back to being the need to lead type. So I'm not ready to give her a pass on that one yet, just because of the strength of the field here. The runner-up only got a 92, so definitely not a strong field. And I would not – this is not a filly I'd want to bet if she steps back up in the graded company.
I think that's a fair point because let's keep in mind the horse that she was chasing was actually the longest shot in the field, so she didn't really project to be around for that long. And Laocothea was basically leading this field with an uncontested advantage for about the final 4 furlongs of this race. So you're probably right that you don't want to put too much stock in her overcoming just a tiny bit of adversity in this start. That's all the racing from this week. Still a couple more weeks, or I think 3 more weeks before we get to some big racing later this month. I know they're running that 2-year-old stakes card, I think in 2 weeks, where Tis the Law is supposed to be in action in the Kentucky Jockey Club. I think we're still 3 weeks away from the Cigar Mile card at Aqueduct. So I think we'll be talking still about some lower level racing over the next couple of weeks. I was just looking at the schedule at Aqueduct. I think there are just a couple of New York bred stakes races on tap for next weekend. So we'll probably talk about a lot more maiden and allowance races, but I think that's fine with us. Craig, looking forward to discussing all of that. We'll be back on the TimeformUS forecast on Friday to talk about this weekend's races. So, Craig, thanks for talking about the races this week. As always, you can listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast and the TimeformUS forecast on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form and tune in again later this week. We'll talk again soon.